Hold on,
How
Mother.
dare
We're
you
almost
show
there.
your face
Just
in
a little
here?
further.
Get out of my
I'm
sight!
so cold.
Amidst
I
the
can't
bitter
feel
cold
anything.
of a harsh
Hold
winter,
on, Mother.
the greedy older brother pushed
I'm
his
so
younger brother
cold.
out into the
I'm
unforgiving
here.
snow.
I'm here.
Loading his ailing mother onto a worn wooden handcart padded with straw, the younger brother wandered aimlessly into the frozen wilds, tears of blood welling in his eyes. Just as his mind began to fade from the agonizing grip of starvation and frost, a mysterious old hermit of grotesque appearance manifested before him.
Pull your mother and walk 1,000 miles to the east.
Though mocked by the villagers and called a madman, the younger brother silently bore the weight of his task and marched onward. What miraculous twist awaited the poor young man at the end of his 1,000-mile pilgrimage?
In a humble parish village nestled within the kingdom borders, there lived 2 brothers whose natures were as different as heaven and earth.
The older brother, Oswald, was a man so maddened by greed that village gossip claimed he had bought his high standing with pure silver. The younger brother, Thomas, was a simple, honest peasant who spent his days chopping wood in the forest to support his elderly mother. Originally, the estate left behind by their parents was quite substantial. However, the very moment their father passed away to the next life, Oswald's eyes changed, gleaming with the hunger of a starving wolf. Before the earth had even settled over their father's grave, Oswald presented forged debt ledgers and false mortgage contracts, proving their late father owed him an insurmountable sum. Through these vile but legally binding documents, Oswald seized every last piece of gold and all the fertile manor fields into his own name. As for their sick, bedridden mother, Martha, he did not openly banish her, but maliciously cut off all her food rations and firewood, forcing her to languish in a drafty, ruined stable. To his brother Thomas, he tossed nothing but a worn wooden handcart, leaving him to watch their mother waste away in the freezing cold. It was a day when the north wind howled, bringing a bitter winter storm that felt as though it would slice right through human flesh. Oswald was sitting comfortably by the roaring hearth fire, drinking warm spiced wine and chewing on rich roasted meats. The moment he saw his younger brother Thomas step into the manor hall, Oswald threw down his iron fork and bellowed in fury. "You wretched fool, Thomas! How dare you set foot in my pristine hall? That foul stench of damp wood and peasant squalor on your clothes is burning my nose." Thomas felt as though his heart was collapsing at his brother's cruel words. But knowing he did not have even a spoonful of thin barley soup to offer his mother in the freezing stable the next morning, Thomas swallowed his pride, fell to his knees at his brother's boots, and pleaded through his tears. "Brother, I beg of you, show us mercy just this once. Mother's illness has grown so severe in that ruined stable that I must fetch a remedy from the apothecary. But I do not have a single copper penny to my name. If you would only share a few silver shillings from the vast chests of gold you took, I will never forget your grace." But Oswald's reaction was colder than the winter air, and infinitely more cruel. Oswald hawked up a wad of phlegm, spat it directly onto the hem of Thomas's coarse wool tunic, and kicked his younger brother squarely in the chest with a wicked sneer. "Money! What share of this estate belongs to you? I protected every piece of this gold by losing sleep night after night. Is it my fault that the old woman is sick?
Your own laziness and incompetence brought her to that state. Put that sick old woman on your handcart and leave my lands at once."
"I will not tolerate the cursed misfortune of a diseased beggar lingering on my estate for another second." And so, unable to bear watching his mother freeze to death in the ruined stable, Thomas made the desperate choice to take her away to find a path to survival. In the dead center of a brutal winter storm, Thomas pulled his coughing, frail mother upon a worn wooden handcart heavily padded with straw, cast out into the frozen mud of the road. Behind him, the heavy thud of Oswald slamming the great oak doors and sliding the iron bolt shut echoed through the chill. Thomas swallowed his tears of blood and began to push endlessly toward the snow-covered mountain paths. The road ahead of the banished brother was nothing but an endless, blinding stretch of white. On the straw of the wooden handcart, Martha's body felt as light as a hollowed-out husk. Yet the weight of despair pressing down on Thomas's hands was heavier than a mountain of iron. The biting gales rushed at him from all sides, threatening to shred his thin, threadbare tunic. With every violent gust, Thomas gripped the handles of the handcart tighter, desperately praying that the meager warmth of his own body might somehow reach his mother. "Mother, hold on just a little longer. I will find us a place to hide from this wicked wind soon." Thomas tried his best to keep his voice steady, but he could not hide the loud chattering of his teeth as he shivered uncontrollably. From her bed of straw on the handcart, Martha drew ragged, shallow breaths, her frail voice barely a whisper against her son's ear. She could not even form the words, coughing dryly into the freezing air, a sound as pitiful as torn parchment flapping in a winter gale. More than any resentment toward his brother, Thomas was consumed by the terrifying thought that his mother, who had suffered her entire life, might freeze to death on a desolate road. He forced his numb legs to move faster. As they trudged onward, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, dark shadows across the mountain pass, and the eerie howling of wolves began to echo from the deep woods. Thomas's legs gave out, and he collapsed face first into the snowdrifts time and time again. Every time he fell, his knees bruised against hidden rocks, and jagged shards of ice tore under his fingernails, forcing a silent scream from his throat. Yet, terrified that he might frighten his mother, he bit his lip until it bled and forced himself back to his feet. Peering through the cracks of their wooden shutters, the villagers watched Thomas's tragic retreat and clicked their tongues in pity. Anyone might have tossed him a crust of stale oat bread, but terrified of Oswald's wrath and his ruthless grip on the village, they all held their breath and turned a blind eye. The charity of men is truly a fickle thing. Like flies to honey, they swarm to a prosperous house, but leave only the cold wind to blow through a ruined family. Thomas finally found a meager shelter beneath the crumbling stone archway of an abandoned roadside chapel at the edge of the parish. With its walls caved in and the roof torn away, the ruin was less a sanctuary and more of an ice cave. Thomas desperately scraped together wet twigs and dead branches from the snow, trying to spark a fire. But the damp wood only hissed and spat out thick, choking smoke, refusing to catch a flame. Coughing and weeping from the smoke, Thomas's hands were already turning a deadly shade of blue from frostbite. A sight so pitiful it would break any honest man's heart. Oh, the heavens are truly blind! Why must such cruel trials fall upon my Thomas, who has lived his whole life honestly, never coveting what belongs to another? Martha's quiet sobbing scattered into the freezing air. Unable to find the words to comfort her, Thomas ignored the gnawing ache in his own belly. He reached into his tunic and carefully pulled out a half-eaten piece of cold, hard bread, gently pressing it to his mother's cracked lips. It was the absolute last of his rations, bought with a copper coin he had earned selling firewood days ago. He had survived on nothing but melted snow for days, just to save the best for his mother. It was a night of such profound devotion that it would make the heavens themselves weep. While Thomas spent the night rubbing his frozen hands beneath the ruined chapel, a completely different scene was unfolding back at Oswald's manor hall. The great room was sweltering with the heat of the hearth, and the heavy oak table groaned under the weight of rich, grease-laden meats and sweet, fragrant ale. Oswald had piled his gold and silver coins right in the center of his chambers. Sitting atop his hoard, he counted his pouches of shillings one by one, a greedy, wicked smile plastered across his face. Ah, this feels magnificent. Now that I have finally swept out that idiot Thomas and that coughing old hag, even the air in this manor smells sweeter, does it not? Oswald chuckled darkly, passing a silver goblet of wine to his wife. Agnes, Oswald's wife, was a woman just as blinded by wealth and vanity as her husband. She cared not a single bit whether her mother-in-law froze to death in the mud. Her only concern was making sure the fine silk scarf wrapped around her neck did not get wrinkled. The two of them reveled in their cruelty, acting as if they were untouchable lords of the earth. The following morning, as soon as the snow stopped falling, Oswald intentionally gathered a group of villagers and marched them toward the ruined chapel. It was a calculated move to justify his actions and completely exile Thomas from the parish boundaries forever. Thomas, having stayed awake all night to protect his mother's fading body heat, looked like a walking corpse. His beard was disheveled, and dark, hollow shadows had sunk deep beneath his eyes. Seeing this wretched state, Oswald covered his nose with his velvet sleeve and spat on the frozen ground. What a foul sight! Are you still squatting here like a stray dog? This entire village is practically my land. Who gave a filthy beggar like you the right to claim a spot here? Thomas struggled to his feet, desperately trying to beg his brother for mercy one last time. But before Thomas could even utter a single word, Oswald raised his heavy wooden walking stick and struck Thomas viciously across the shoulder. With a sickening thud, Thomas was sent crashing back into the snowbank, but Oswald's rage was far from satisfied. If you want to play the devoted son, you should have crawled into the forest and died quietly. Why must you pollute the eyes of decent folk? You are a disgrace to our bloodline and a curse upon this village. The gathered villagers, completely cowed by Oswald's authority, could not bring themselves to intervene. Taking it a step further, Oswald kicked over the small pile of damp firewood Thomas had painstakingly gathered, scattering the sticks into the deep snow. Watching this cruelty from her bed of straw on the handcart, Martha beat her chest and wept bitterly. But Oswald did not even blink, merely letting out a vile, mocking laugh. Look at this! This is the will of God! A penniless wretch tries to play the pious son, and even the trees and mountains laugh at him. I warn you, never let me see your face anywhere near my lands again. If you ever cross my path once more, I will drag you before the sheriff and have him break both your legs. Remember that. Oswald sneered pompously, turned his back, and marched away. Thomas, unable to even gather his scattered twigs, clutched at his broken heart. The tyranny of the wicked seemed endless, and the tears of the weak only turned to cold ice upon their frozen feet. It was a sight so merciless that even the black crows watching from the dead branches seemed to caw in sorrow before flying away. The morning at the ruined chapel, left in the wake of Oswald's brutal beating and mockery, was quieter and colder than death itself. More than the throbbing agony in his bruised shoulder, Thomas was driven to the brink of madness by the terrifying realization that the breathing of his mother, resting on the wooden handcart, was growing fainter by the minute. Seeing the morning frost frozen solid upon Martha's white hair, Thomas tore at his own chest in sheer helplessness. Mother, please, you must wake up. I have committed a grave sin against you. What a cursed life you lead, having such a worthless son. Thomas brought his frozen, stiff hands to his mouth, blowing his warm breath upon them, before gently rubbing his mother's icy cheeks. But her skin had already lost its color, dry and fragile as old parchment. Thomas made a desperate vow. If they remained in these ruins, he would surely lose his mother forever. Ignoring the freezing snow packing into his worn leather shoes, he gripped the coarse wooden handles of the handcart once more. He resolved to cross the treacherous mountain pass to the neighboring fiefdom, hoping to beg for just one bowl of warm broth to save her. But the heavens seemed entirely devoid of mercy. The path over the mountain was a nightmare of sheer cliffs and jagged, icy rocks. With every step, fresh blood seeped from his blistered, frost-bitten toes, staining the pristine white snow a stark crimson. His vision spun violently from starvation, and his limbs trembled like leaves in a storm. Yet, thinking only of the fragile thread of life clinging to his mother on the cart, Thomas forced himself up the steep mountain ridge. But just as he neared the summit, the sky suddenly turned pitch black. A blinding, furious blizzard unleashed its wrath upon the mountain. The wind roared like a starving beast, physically shoving Thomas toward the edge of a deadly precipice. Thomas lost his footing and nearly tumbled down the sheer drop, but he threw his arm out, desperately grabbing onto a patch of frozen thorn bushes. The sharp thorns pierced deep into his palms, spilling warm blood onto the ice, but Thomas was entirely numb to the pain. "No, if you must take a life, take mine. I beg of you, just spare my mother." Thomas screamed his agonizing plea into the endless void. But the only answer he received was the deafening howl of the winter wind and the cold echo of the mountains. On the handcart, his mother could no longer even muster a groan. The bitter cold sliced through Thomas's bare flesh like a freshly sharpened broadsword. His skin quickly turned a bruised, sickly purple. The embers of hope were dying out, and the world around him plunged into pitch-black darkness. Unable to fight his heavy eyelids, Thomas felt his consciousness slipping away. Was this the reward for an honest life and a son's devotion? To die like a starving beggar in the muddy snow? Was it truly the way of the world that his cruel brother Oswald laughed by a roaring hearth fire in the manor hall, while the righteous perished in the freezing dark? A single tear rolled down Thomas's cheek, freezing into a solid icicle at his chin as the tragic winter night deepened. The agonizing pain faded, replaced by a strange, weightless lethargy. Instinctively, Thomas knew this was the final embrace of the winter freeze. Yet, with his last ounce of strength, he refused to let go of the thick hempen ropes of the wooden cart. If he collapsed, the cart bearing Martha would tumble down the jagged ravine. "Mother," he whispered internally, swallowing a voice that could no longer speak, "I shall go first and wait for you in the Lord's kingdom. In your next life, may you be born to a wealthy landowner, free from this endless suffering." His head slowly slumped forward. Suddenly, cutting through the roaring blizzard, a rhythmic tapping echoed. It sliced through the freezing air and struck Thomas's ears. He tried to force his frozen eyelids open, wondering if it was the footfalls of a forest beast. Emerging from the blinding dark was an ancient figure, draped in a tattered, weather-beaten cloak. It was Silas. The mysterious old hermit possessed a bizarre, unearthly visage. His face was etched with wrinkles as deep as the bark of an ancient oak, and his eyes gleamed with a piercing, unnatural light in the dark. Silas walked across the treacherous, storm-battered slope with the ease of a nobleman strolling through a courtyard, stopping right before the dying young peasant. "How foolish!" Silas's voice was low, yet it carried a power that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountain. "Your own life hangs by a thread, yet you carry a rotting vessel up this cursed peak. What mortal duty binds you so fiercely that you throw away your life?" Believing it to be a dying vision, Thomas summoned his final breath and grasped the hem of the old hermit's cloak. His fingers were completely numb, but a desperate obsession to save his mother overpowered his own will to live. "My lord, please, I beg of you, help us. I do not care if I perish, but please spare Martha. She is a frail widow, starved by my brother, with nowhere to go. I beg of you." At Thomas's desperate plea, Silas offered a hollow, detached smile. The mysterious old hermit reached into his rough woolen pouch and drew out a small, glowing herbal bead, pressing it past Thomas's chapped lips. Instantly, a miraculous, blazing heat surged through Thomas's frozen veins. His heart pounded fiercely, and a sharp, stinging pain accompanied the returning warmth to his lifeless limbs. Gasping for air, Thomas threw himself at Silas's feet, bowing his head repeatedly in profound gratitude. But Silas's expression remained as cold as the stone walls of a winter chapel. Staring directly into Thomas's eyes, Silas delivered a chilling, prophetic command. "I have bound your soul to your flesh for a short while, but Martha's fate is still a candle in the biting wind. Do you truly wish to save her? Then rise this instant Take up the handles of that wooden cart and walk due east. You must walk 1,000 miles without a single deviation. If you halt your steps, or if you dare to look back, your mother's breath will cease that very second. And you shall become meat for the black hounds of the forest. Do you understand? 1,000 miles? To pull a sick, elderly woman on a wooden handcart for 1,000 miles in the dead of winter was nothing short of a death sentence for any commoner. But Thomas had no choice. Whether this was the saving grace of a saint or the final cruel jest of a demon of the woods, Thomas gripped the handles of his cart once more. The sight of Silas standing at the edge of the blizzard-swept cliff was so surreal, he could not tell if he was waking or dreaming. The mystical bead in his mouth kept the flame of life burning within him. "Master Hermit," Thomas trembled, feeling the crushing weight of the command. 1,000 miles is beyond mortal endurance. In this bitter winter famine, how can I pull my sick mother such a distance? Silas did not even grant him a glance. He simply pointed his wooden staff toward the eastern sky. His eyes held no pity, only a chilling detachment that seemed to transcend mortal suffering. The truth of this world is that nothing is gained without tearing away one's own flesh. Oswald took the silver coins and lost his soul. Will you take on suffering to find the true path? Every step you take east is a prayer that extends your mother's life. At the end of the 1,000 miles, a destiny beyond your wildest dreams awaits. But heed this warning well. Harbor even a sliver of doubt, or turn your feet away from the east, and Martha shall instantly turn to a handful of dust. With those final words, Silas faded into the thick mist, vanishing without a trace. Thomas called out to the hermit several times into the empty void, but the only reply was the howling wind sweeping through the valley. On the wooden handcart, Martha was miraculously breathing evenly, fallen into a deep, peaceful slumber. It was as if she were shielded by the old hermit's divine protection. Thomas clenched his fists. What did he have to lose? The world had no warm hearth or welcoming manor hall for him. Rather than dying in the muddy market square after being pushed away by his greedy older brother, trusting the words of the mysterious old hermit was his only salvation. Checking the direction of the rising sun, Thomas took his first step due east. His torn soles burned with agony, but strangely, the weight of the wooden cart did not feel as crushing as before. The grand pilgrimage of 1,000 miles was an endless succession of pain and endurance. To chart his course, Thomas woke before dawn every day to study the sky. On overcast days, he used the shadow of the wooden staff Silas had left behind to find his way. The most wondrous thing was that whenever he marched steadily east, he would find warm barley bread, oat cakes, or wild winter berries left in a small basket tied to his cart, as if placed by unseen hands. A true miracle, Thomas thought. Who would leave such bounty in these desolate woods? Believing it to be Silas's divine providence, Thomas carefully fed the softest bread and berries to Martha. He ate only the meager scraps, just enough to stave off starvation, his profound devotion never wavering. Along the treacherous castle roads and wild trails, He faced raging rivers and dark caves where massive bears and wolves were said to lair. Yet, whenever Thomas pressed stubbornly eastward, the river waters seemed to recede, and the fierce beasts of the forest quietly stepped aside into the shadows. But divine miracles could not entirely mask the agony of mortal flesh. As 10 days passed, then a month, Thomas's worn leather shoes rotted away completely. His bare feet became a mangled mess of blood, blisters, and calluses. The biting winter cold eventually gave way, only to be replaced by the choking dust of spring winds and unpredictable freezing rains. Whenever he passed through a medieval village, the villagers pointed and mocked the ragged peasant pulling an old woman on a handcart. "Look at that wretch," the villagers gossiped near the parish church, "pulling his mother east like a madman." What terrible sin did he commit against the crown authority to suffer such a fool's errand? The ridicule and scorn sliced at Thomas's heart like a rusted blade. Peasant children threw stones from the muddy lanes, and traveling merchants at the roadside inns clicked their tongues in pity and disgust. Yet Thomas kept his mouth tightly shut and offered no reply. He only etched Silas's dire warning into his heart: never doubt, never look back, and took each step as if it were a sacred chapel prayer. One night, Thomas saw Silas again in a dream. The mysterious old hermit handed him a sealed parchment and a small antique flask. "You have traveled half the distance," Silas spoke. "The water in this flask is the water of life, to quench your mother's parched throat. But if you succumb to your own thirst and drink from it first, the blessing of your 1,000-mile penance will turn to ash." Thomas awoke with a start, trembling as he felt the cold, heavy flask resting in his blistered hands. This was no mere journey. It was a grand trial set by the heavens to test his devotion and endurance. Clutching the flask Silas had left in the waking world, Thomas felt the agonizing fire of his own thirst. He had not had a proper drop of water in days. His lips were cracked like dry mud, and the metallic taste of blood coated his throat. But Thomas thought only of Martha, who was groaning faintly on the wooden cart. He cradled the flask against his chest, as if it were the king's own royal seal. "Mother, hold on just a little longer." "We are almost there," Thomas croaked, his voice raw and broken. He unsealed the flask and carefully let the water trickle past Martha's dry lips. Then a truly breathtaking sight unfolded. The liquid that flowed from the flask was no ordinary well water. It carried a sweet, herbal fragrance and shimmered with a golden, divine light. As Martha drank the mystical elixir, her pale, sickly complexion was instantly flushed with warm vitality. The deep wrinkles on her face smoothed out like snow melting under the spring sun. And the miracles did not end there. A single remaining drop of the glowing water rolled from the flask and fell onto Thomas's ruined, bloody feet. Instantly, the agonizing wounds vanished, replaced by fresh, unblemished skin. Thomas rubbed his eyes in disbelief and touched his feet. The excruciating pain that had made him want to scream just moments before was completely gone, and his body felt as light as a feather, as if he were walking on clouds. This was the first true reward from the heavens, an acknowledgement of his pure heart.
Thomas fell to his knees in the dirt and bowed deeply toward the eastern sky over and over again. The villagers may have laughed at him and called him a madman, but Thomas was now absolutely certain.
At the end of this grueling road, it was not despair that awaited him, but a radiant salvation.
Grasping the handles of the wooden handcart once more, Thomas marched eastward with a stride far more powerful than before.
By the time he crossed the 800th mile and entered the final stretch of his 1,000-mile quest, his clothes were still the tattered rags of a poor peasant, but his aura was entirely transformed. Even the wild beasts that prowled the forest paths felt the pure, unshakable weight in his clear eyes and quietly yielded the road to him. Even the foul beasts of the dark woods dared not approach the pure, divine aura of his filial devotion. Yet the whispers of the miraculous path Thomas walked were carried by the winter winds, spreading far and wide across the kingdom. Eventually, the village gossip reached the grand manor hall of his arrogant brother, Oswald. What was this? That foolish Thomas was pulling the old woman eastward, his feet glowing with holy light, and the frail mother was healing? Oswald hurled his silver goblet of ale against the stone hearth, bellowing in rage. Is it not the nature of a greedy man to suffer as though poisoned when he sees another prosper? Consumed by envy, Oswald could not bear the thought that Thomas might possess some priceless relic given by the mysterious old hermit Silas. He immediately emptied his coin purse and gathered a band of cutthroats and outlaws from the muddy market square. Find the wretch! Go and strip him of his flask and his bundle. If he resists, bury him alive in the frozen dirt along with the old woman. Under Oswald's wicked command, the ruthless bandits set off on the trail of Thomas. Bound by the vow to walk only due east, Thomas could not avoid the open castle roads. The outlaws, cowardly as they were, waited in the encroaching shadows for Thomas to tire, slowly closing the distance. Instinctively, Thomas felt the cold, murderous intent creeping up his spine. Yet the stern warning of Silas echoed in his mind. The moment you look back, all your grace will turn to ash. Thomas felt his heart pounding against his ribs like a war drum, cold sweat soaking his linen tunic, but he absolutely refused to turn his head. He could hear the heavy boots and the scraping of drawn steel right at his heels. Yet he kept his gaze fixed solely on the eastern horizon, where the sun would rise, walking in silent endurance. Peril surrounded him, and the clutches of evil were inches from his throat. The unyielding resolve of Thomas had already become an invisible fortress of stone, shielding him from harm. It was a perilous moment, the outlaws raising their rusted blades to strike at his back. Following Oswald's vile orders, the bandits sought to exploit the fact that Thomas would never look back. In a cowardly move, they hurled a thick hempen rope to snare his ankles. But the steps Thomas took toward the east were already imbued with a sacred grace no mortal could breach. The very instant the rope left their hands, a blinding, heavenly light erupted from the eastern sky, searing the eyes of the outlaws. "My eyes! I cannot see!" The bandits shrieked in agony, tripping over their own feet and rolling in the muddy ditch. Even amidst the chaotic screams, Thomas never once turned his head to check. Keeping his eyes strictly forward, his worn leather shoes finally carried him to the crest of the final ridge, marking the end of his 1,000-mile pilgrimage. The vista that unfolded beyond the ridge was nothing short of majestic. An endless expanse of deep blue sea churned at the eastern edge of the world, and from the heart of those waters, a crimson sun was ascending. Thomas, still pulling the wooden handcart, walked until his feet touched the wet sands of the shore. The very moment the ocean waves washed over his soles, the gentle, resonant voice of Silas whispered in his ears once more, "You have endured much. Now set down your burden and look behind you." Thomas carefully lowered the handles of the wooden handcart to the sand and turned around. The moment he did, he froze entirely in place. Resting upon the straw of the cart was not his sick, elderly mother, Martha. Instead, a radiant woman, cloaked in garments as white as freshly fallen snow, stood before him, wearing a merciful, angelic smile. In truth, Martha had passed away peacefully on the handcart during a harsh night, her soul gently lifted to heaven by the grace of the holy water flask. The figure Thomas had been pulling ever since was an angel of mercy who had borrowed his mother's ailing form to guide him. The grueling remainder of the 1,000-mile journey had been a divine test of Thomas's devotion and endurance, a heavenly design to lead him to the eastern capital to receive the supreme rewards of God. Meanwhile, back in the medieval village, dark omens began to plague Oswald, who had been eagerly awaiting news of Thomas's death. The outlaws he had sent to murder his brother returned as stumbling, blinded beggars. From the heavy iron chest where Oswald hoarded his silver and gold, grotesque, weeping sounds echoed through the manor hall every night. Unable to sleep out of sheer terror, Oswald drank heavily of strong mead, desperately trying to drown his fears. Bah! What do these foolish rumors matter? I still possess enough gold to buy a kingdom. There is no way that beggar survived. Despite Oswald's arrogant boasting, the crops in his vast manor fields turned sickly yellow and withered overnight. Whenever the villagers passed by Oswald's estate, they spat on the ground and pointed their fingers in scorn. It is the wrath of the heavens! He starved his own mother and cast his brother into the freezing jaws of death. It is no wonder the ghosts weep in his halls. Agnes, Oswald's greedy wife, fell bedridden from the stress of their dwindling fortune, and the manor's servants, terrified by the cursed atmosphere, packed their meager belongings and fled one by one. Evil rarely recognizes its own sins, often inviting even greater ruin upon itself. Believing all his misfortunes were the fault of Thomas, Oswald spent his remaining silver coins to summon a cunning hedge witch to cleanse the manor. Yet, before the witch could even begin her chants, she trembled like a leaf in the winter wind and pointed a crooked finger at Oswald's face. "Lord, have mercy! There is a weeping old woman shedding tears of blood clinging to your back." Soon, not a single living soul of your bloodline will remain in this cursed house. At the witch's shriek, Oswald turned pale as a corpse and collapsed. His once glorious wealth was already crumbling like a castle made of sand. Then, on a clear spring day, a magnificent carriage procession appeared at the village crossroads. Surrounded by dozens of liveried guards, a young lord dressed in fine velvet and silk rode into the settlement, carrying the authority of a royal duke or a high steward. The villagers dropped their jaws in awe, whispering among themselves, wondering who this grand nobleman could be. This young lord was none other than Thomas, who had returned with divine treasures and the blessings of the heavens at the end of his 1,000-mile journey. However, Thomas draped his old, tattered peasant cloak over his fine garments to conceal his true identity. He made his way first to the estate of his brother, Oswald. The manor, which had once rivaled a royal castle, was now overgrown with weeds, its roof caving in, looking like a haunted, desolate ruin. When Thomas knocked on the rotting wooden gates, a haggard, skeletal Oswald peeked out. Failing to recognize Thomas, and assuming this was merely a wealthy traveling merchant, Oswald bowed his head in pathetic subservience. "Oh, my good lord, you must be a noble traveler passing through." "As you can see, my house has fallen into ruin, and I have nothing to offer you. If you could spare but a few copper pennies in charity, I shall never forget your grace." The imposing arrogance of the man, who just months ago had kicked his brother into the snowdrift, had vanished completely, leaving only a sickly, aging, greedy fool. Thomas clicked his tongue in pity, but feigned ignorance. "I heard the master of this estate was the wealthiest landowner in the realm. How did you come to be in such a wretched state?" Oswald wiped away his tears and immediately began to blame his brother and mother. "Do not even speak of it, my lord. I had a foolish, dim-witted younger brother who sucked all the good fortune from this house and ran away, leaving me in this misery. If only I could catch that wretch, I could fill my iron chests with gold once more." Oswald was still hopelessly trapped in the shackles of his own greed, spewing vain delusions without even realizing who stood before him. Hearing his brother's words, Thomas felt the very last spark of familial affection turn to ice in his heart. The time to strip away this mask of hypocrisy and deliver a devastating judgment was at hand. Keeping his identity hidden, Thomas decided to lay one final snare to test Oswald's boundless greed. From beneath his cloak, Thomas pulled out a brilliantly glowing, fake ingot of gold and waved it slightly before Oswald's eyes. Like a starving wolf, Oswald's eyes darted wildly, chasing the radiant gleam of the metal. "My lord, is that truly pure gold? In all my days, I have never seen such a beautiful luster." Oswald swallowed hard, clinging to the hem of Thomas's cloak. Thomas looked down at Oswald with an intentionally haughty expression. "This is a mystical gold bar obtained at the very edge of the Eastern Sea. If you hand over your rusted gold to me, I shall give you a sealed parchment map showing where chests full of this divine gold are hidden. After all, the gold in your vaults has already lost its shine, has it not?" No sooner had the words left Thomas's lips than Oswald dragged out the rusted iron chest he had hidden deep within his bedchamber. In truth, the gold within that chest had long turned into blackened stones due to Oswald's wicked deeds. But Oswald was entirely consumed by the delusion that the map would make him a wealthy lord once more. Oswald even bundled together the ancestral deeds to his manor lands and offered them to Thomas. Here it is.
This is my entire fortune. Now hand over the map quickly. I shall never suffer this accursed poverty again.
Oswald snatched the fake parchment map Thomas handed him and burst into a maniacal fit of laughter. The map was, in reality, nothing but a blank piece of parchment whose ink would dissolve into nothingness within a few days. But blind greed was driving him straight to his doom. Thomas felt a bitter ache in his heart, watching his brother dig his own grave. But the divine laws of cause and effect could not be defied. When Agnes learned that Oswald had handed over their entire estate to a stranger, she raised a clamor that shook the ruined rafters that very night.
You mad old fool! You gave away the deeds to our lands to a passing stranger? Have you lost your mind?
Agnes grabbed Oswald by the collar and shook him violently, while Oswald, clutching the map to his chest, shoved her away. What does a foolish, low-born woman know? With this map, we shall not just be wealthy landowners, we shall possess more gold than the king himself. The two tore at each other, screaming insults, entirely consumed by their own infighting. Their marriage, forged only by a mutual lust for wealth, turned them into bitter enemies the moment that wealth vanished. The relatives who rushed over upon hearing the commotion only mocked Oswald's sheer stupidity and turned their backs on him. The villagers, who had only ever suffered oppression and never an ounce of charity from Oswald, clicked their tongues, finding bitter satisfaction in the spectacle. So this is how the mighty fall. He made others weep tears of blood, and now he shall have dirt in his own eyes. Trembling with anxious desperation, Oswald took the map and sprinted madly toward the east. However, the destination he reached was not a hidden vault of treasure, but the edge of a jagged cliff lashed by violent storms. As Oswald unrolled the parchment under the darkened sky, the ink on the map miraculously melted away in an instant, leaving only a single glowing sentence. He who abandons his mother deserves no blessing from the earth. Oswald screamed in sheer agony, thrashing upon the rocky ground, but he was left with nothing but a worthless scrap of rotting paper in his hands. At last, the day of truth arrived. A magnificent carriage halted in the center of the muddy market square, right before the manor court. The parish priest and all the wealthy freeholders of the town came out and bowed deeply. The man who stepped down from the carriage was none other than Thomas, adorned in the majestic armor and fine velvet robes of an ennobled lord. Thomas was no longer a lowly peasant woodcutter. He had traveled to the eastern capital and used the heaven-sent treasures to purchase the entire fiefment of this region directly from the king. Now he was the supreme lord of the county, possessing absolute feudal authority over the lands and its people. At that exact moment, Oswald, wandering past the court in the wretched rags of a beggar, witnessed the grand scene. Oswald rubbed his filthy eyes and stared at the powerful nobleman standing beside the carriage. A familiar face, yet possessing an unapproachable, commanding majesty. The moment Oswald realized that this supreme lord of the fiefment was Thomas, the brother he had cast out to watch their mother starve, his limbs froze solid like blocks of winter ice. How is it that you are standing there? Oswald's voice trembled, a shriek that shattered the cold silence of the muddy market square.
You were supposed to freeze to death in the winter woods. You were nothing but a fool.
Thomas slowly approached his older brother.
In Thomas's eyes, there was no burning wrath, only a deep, profound pity mixed with the chilling weight of absolute justice. From the back of his carriage, Thomas pulled out the very thing that had started it all. He laid the old, splintered wooden handcart at Oswald's feet.
"Do you remember this wooden cart, brother?" Thomas asked, his voice steady and echoing across the courtyard.
"This was the only inheritance you granted me when you locked Martha, our sick mother, in the freezing stable to die. I pulled our mother on this fragile wood for 1,000 miles toward the eastern sea.
You chose the weight of stolen gold and bought your way into hell. But I chose the weight of this handcart and found the grace of heaven.
Tell me, brother, will you now lay the heavy burden of your greed upon this wood?" The villagers, finally realizing the true identity of their new ennobled lord, erupted into thunderous cheers. "Thomas has returned! The righteous son has survived!" they cried out. Amidst the joyous roar, Oswald collapsed, weeping tears of pure terror, realizing he had swung the axe that severed his own feet. Thomas, standing tall on the steps of the manor hall court, witnessed this divine reversal of fate. He immediately ordered his personal guards to seize the wicked brother. "Bind him," Thomas commanded. Oswald thrashed and pleaded, claiming his innocence, but it was useless. Thomas produced a stack of sealed parchments, undeniable proof of Oswald's ruthless usury, his forged debt ledgers, and the cruel deeds that stole manor fields from desperate peasants. Emboldened by Thomas's presence, the villagers poured forward, releasing years of pent-up sorrow. "Punish that wicked man, my lord," one commoner shouted. "He took my barley fields when I could not pay for my child's medicine. He starved his own frail mother in a ruined stable." Thomas glared down at Oswald with eyes as cold as drawn steel. The judgment was swift and absolute, according to feudal law. "By the authority vested in me as the supreme lord of this fiefment, all of Oswald's remaining silver and stolen lands are hereby confiscated and shall be returned to the commoners he has wronged. As for the man himself, he shall be bound to the whipping post, receive 30 lashes, and be banished from this realm forever." Stripped of his fine linen gowns, wearing nothing but torn, bloodied rags, Oswald was dragged out of the village gates. He looked no different from a stray dog tossed into the mud. Yet, the most agonizing punishment was not the tearing of his flesh, but the absolute ruin of his name. He was stripped of his merchant guild status, and not a single soul in the realm would offer him so much as a cup of dirty water. The man who once sat in a warm manor hall, boasting of his overflowing granaries and chests of pounds and shillings, was now forced to dodge stones thrown by the village children, begging for crusts of moldy bread in the rain-soaked lanes. The blade of divine retribution had pierced the wicked man's heart with terrifying precision. Seeking shelter from the biting winds, Oswald crawled into a collapsed, rotting thatched cottage near the edge of the parish graveyard. Every night, he wept tears of blood. As the winter famine and freezing cold gnawed at his bones, the memories of his cruelty flashed before his eyes. God have mercy! What have I done?" he wailed, beating his fists against the crumbling wattle and daub walls. "I had a roaring hearth fire, roasted meats, and sweet ale. Why was I so cruel? Why did I cast them out?" But his cries were meant for the empty wind. His vain and selfish wife, Agnes, had long since cursed him for losing their wealth and fled into the night, abandoning him without a second glance. Instead of the heavy gold bars he had loved so dearly, Oswald was left with nothing but a cracked wooden bowl, gnawed on by rats. In his feverish sleep, he was haunted by visions of Martha. His mother did not scream or curse him. She merely looked at him with eyes full of sorrowful pity. That silent gaze tore Oswald's soul to shreds. He finally understood the old parish scholar's warning that greed is like drinking from the salty sea. The more you drink, the thirstier you become, until it drives you to madness and ruin. He knew now that the old wooden handcart Thomas pulled was the true vessel of salvation. But Oswald was too crushed beneath the weight of his own sins to even stand. In stark contrast, Thomas's life blossomed like a glorious spring morning after a long, dark winter. He did not hoard the royal protection or the purse of gold bestowed upon him by the king. Instead, he poured his wealth into the realm. He built a grand parish school so the orphaned and poor children could learn to read the Holy Scriptures. He opened his granaries, distributing seed grain and strong oxen to the starving peasants so they could plow their own fields and stand on their own feet. The villagers no longer saw him merely as a humble woodcutter. They bowed their heads in reverence, calling him their noble lord and savior. Word of Thomas's unparalleled devotion spread across the kingdom, reaching the royal court. The king himself sent a grand royal seal and a monument of honor to be placed at Thomas's gates, declaring his household a beacon of virtue for all of medieval England. In Thomas's courtyard, the gardens bloomed with vibrant colors regardless of the season, and the sound of joyous singing never ceased. The drops of blood he had shed on the freezing mountain passes had blossomed into thick bushes of radiant red roses around his estate. His scarred, calloused feet, which once bled in worn leather shoes, now walked smoothly in fine velvet boots. Does the Lord not help those who help themselves? Thomas's pure heart, his unwavering sacrifice, and his enduring patience were recognized as the most precious virtues in the world, making him the founding patriarch of a deeply respected noble house. Years turned into decades, and even when Thomas grew into a white-haired old lord, the villagers still removed their hoods and bowed deeply whenever they passed his manor. Every year, during the Great Harvest Festival, Thomas would open his gates to the entire county, hosting a massive feast of roasted meats, fresh bread, and sweet mead. There, by the roaring fire, he would recount the miracle of his 1,000-mile journey. "Listen well, my friends," he would say, his voice thick with emotion. "Every man and woman carries a heavy burden in their heart. It is up to you what you place upon it. If you load it with greed and malice, your path will lead to hell. But if you load it with love, sacrifice, and duty to your kin, that heavy burden will become your chariot to heaven." Surrounded by a wise, loving lady and children who inherited his noble spirit, Thomas lived a life of humble grace. Despite his immense wealth, he never allowed his family to forget their roots. He took that old, weathered wooden handcart and hung it high above the mantel in his great hall as the ultimate family relic. "Never forget the weight of this wood," he instructed his heirs. "This is the foundation upon which our house was built. It is the highest measure of human decency." His descendants, whenever they looked upon that wooden handcart, were reminded to honor their elders and love their neighbors. Legend says that on the day Lord Thomas finally passed from this world, the sky above the village turned a brilliant gold, and the sweet scent of blooming roses and chapel incense filled the air. It was as if the divine spirits he had met at the edge of the sea had come down from the clouds to escort him home. Thomas closed his eyes with a peaceful smile. At his funeral, thousands of lords and commoners from every corner of the kingdom gathered in the cold stone church, weeping openly as they bid farewell to the greatest man they had ever known. His mortal life had ended, but the seeds of compassion he had planted continued to sprout into hope across the land. Well, my friends, was that not a tale of breathtaking turns and profound emotion? Two brothers, born of the same womb and raised under the same thatched roof, yet their choices led them down entirely different paths. Depending on the nature of their hearts, one was reduced to a miserable, starving beggar, while the other rose to become a magnificent lord, revered by all. Oswald, blinded by the glitter of stolen silver, lost the love of his family and the respect of the world. But Thomas, who chose the agonizing path of pulling his frail mother out of a ruined stable and through freezing storms, received the ultimate blessings of heaven. Is this not the very truth of our own lives? In the short term, it may seem as though the wicked prosper and the greedy feast, but the net of divine justice is vast, and no sinner ever slips through its threads. That 1,000-mile journey was not merely a physical trial. It was a purification of the soul, burning away the impurities of the human heart. As the sun sets on our day, why not offer a warm word of love to your parents and those you hold dear? I pray that the boundless grace and miracles bestowed upon Thomas will find their way into your own homes and warm your hearts. And so, let this tale bring a gentle close to your day. May your hearth always be warm,